Hi, welcome to Lesson 5, Boundaries. Boundaries is one of my favorite topics. However, so many writers that I work with who have toxic procrastination and crippling perfectionism really fight me on this. I have so many clients, and once we really start to dig down into the layers of like, okay, this is what's going on, now how do we move ahead? And I'm like, okay, great, first step, boundaries. They're like, put on the brakes. What are you talking about? I don't like to do boundary work. I don't want to talk about boundaries. I feel very uncomfortable about asserting boundaries, the whole bag of it. So let me just say, first of all, as we get into this lesson, if you feel uncomfortable or weird or panicky when you start to think about working on your boundaries, that's totally okay, and that's really normal for writers who are sensitive, intuitive, working with toxic procrastination, working with crippling perfectionism. All of that stuff is really normal, and it's okay if you feel that way. You don't have to be a rock star at this right out of the gate. We are just going to look at some gentle ways we can start to really dig into what's going on with our boundaries, and gentle ways we can start to adjust those boundaries with other people. So, first of all, why boundaries? That's the next question I get. People are like, I want to work on my writing. I want to work on my creativity. I don't understand why we're talking about boundaries. I don't understand why we're talking about relationships with other people. This has nothing to do with my writing and creativity. So the answer is yes, it does. In fact, it has a lot to do with your writing and your creativity. All of this stuff is intertwined. The reason that you cannot move ahead with your writing, the reason that you suffer so horribly from any negative criticism of your writing, is because you have weakened, dysfunctional boundaries. Now, again, I want to back up because I know so many people who are watching this are really sensitive and also have a lot of sensitivity around this matter in particular. So I just want to emphasize and state again, this is not your fault. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not a bad person. This is not something to like fix about yourself. This is very normal for sensitive writers who are dealing with procrastination and perfectionism to also have boundary issues. It is because most likely these types of writers grew up in a family environment with narcissistic family dynamics and or family enmeshment. So the way that you grew up, healthy boundaries were not modeled to you. You probably grew up in a household where when you tried to assert a boundary or you tried to say, hey, my boundary's been crossed or I don't feel comfortable with that, you were shamed for that. Your parents said you were ungrateful or you were selfish or you were being weird or touchy or overreactive. You were gaslit in some way around you asserting a boundary. Basically, you were made to feel like a bad person if you wanted to have normal, healthy boundaries with the other people in your life. So you grew up thinking that it's not okay to have your own boundaries. It's not okay to express your own boundaries. You have to let other people set the boundaries, right? So that's where that all comes from. And that's not your fault. That's just the way you grew up, and that was the way of being that was modeled to you as a child. So now, however, we are in the present day as grown-up adults, and we can start to shift and change things. We don't have to just make do with these poor boundaries and go along as we always have. We can start to work on them. So people who have weakened and dysfunctional boundaries, some of you might already know you have these. Many INFJs and INFPs I talk to say, oh yeah, I've always had boundary problems. This is an ongoing issue in my life. Again, I'm raising my hand here as well. I've always had boundary issues. They're really hard for me. They always have been. It's gotten a lot easier in recent years, but I know the struggle well. Some people have no idea that they have weakened or dysfunctional boundaries. They're sort of like, well, I don't really know what you're talking about. Like, I don't really think about boundaries a lot, but I guess they're fine. Like, I think everything's fine. So we're just going to go over a couple of the ways, the two main ways, in fact, that weakened and dysfunctional boundaries show up, so you can start to see how that plays out and what that looks like in your own life. So the first one is people who have weakened and dysfunctional boundaries tend to have a yes-no imbalance. So what that means when someone has a yes-no imbalance, when they are asked something, when something's requested of them, especially if they're put on the spot and they don't have time to think about it, when they're unsure, they automatically say yes. And they usually say it very quickly. They're just like, yep, sure, I'll do that. I'll take on that extra task at work. I'll go to the birthday party I don't really want to go to. I'll clean out your garage with you. You know, they just sort of say yes on automatic pilot. And then later they're like, oh, I really wish I had said no. Sometimes even in the moment, they're like, oh, I really want to say no, but I feel like I have to say yes. With people who have healthy boundaries, the opposite is true. People who have healthy boundaries, when someone asks something of them and they're not sure if they have the energy to do that, or if they can do that, or if it's a good idea for them to do that, they will automatically say no, or they'll say, let me think about it and get back to you. But most often they'll be like, no, I don't think so right now, like that's not gonna work. And then they might change that later according to their preferences. Like they might go home and think about it and be like, you know what, actually the birthday party on Saturday does sound fun. I'm gonna call, Carol and tell her I'll make it. But the person who has weak and dysfunctional boundaries, they say yes right out of the gate. So the other part of the yes-no imbalance is the person with weakened dysfunctional boundaries says yes too much of the time. And that a lot of the time comes from them just saying yes on automatic pilot. But they also say yes even if they have time to think about it, even if they already know that it's really a no for them, because they feel guilty. They feel like they should say yes to other people, and they tend to cave in very easily when other people lay guilt trips on them. They're very, very susceptible to guilt. So that I'm saying yes all the time, that's sort of, I'm trying to be a good person, I'm trying to please other people, and I'm also trying to relieve that sense of guilt I feel when I say no. I'm trying to prevent even having that sense of guilt because it's so painful. So that's the first way that weakened dysfunctional boundaries show up. The second way you can really see this in people is in the way they respond to the anger of others. Now, I know so many of you are INFJ and INFP personality types, and these types classically do not like conflict. They feel very uncomfortable when things are out of harmony. They're very tuned in to the emotions of others, and they don't like it when there's a lot of negative conflict and negative emotions swirling around them. So that's part of it. But the other part is that, again, people who have weakened dysfunctional boundaries, who are a lot of INFJ and INFP people, and writers with procrastination and perfectionism issues, the anger response from others pushes them into another form of going on automatic pilot. So people with poor boundaries tend to respond to the anger of others in three ways. Number one, they people please. This is by far the most frequent reaction. Somebody around them gets angry, and sometimes it doesn't even have to do with them. They're not actually like directly angry with them, but they will know that someone around them is angry, and they go into people pleasing or approval seeking mode. So they're like, oh, what can I do? Let me try to change the mood. Let me try to shift the energy. Let me do this or do that. Or again, let me say yes when I really mean no, because the person's now getting angry about it, right? So someone says, hey, do you want to go to the birthday party over at Carol's on Saturday afternoon? And the person's like, I don't know, not really. And then they start to get angry, and then the person's like, oh, okay, yes, I'll go. Yes. So they see that anger response and they go into people-pleasing mode. The second thing they do, this is usually the second choice, is they try to rescue or fix the person who is angry, right? So this classically happens with people who are making bad choices, right? So you might have a friend and they make the same bad choice over and over again, right? Like they have a drug abuse problem and they keep going out, on Sunday afternoons and getting high. And you can see that this is really ruining their life, right? And then when you talk to that person, you're like, hey, I'm really worried about you. It seems like you're doing a lot of drugs lately. The person gets angry. Then we would go into like fix it rescue mode, well, let me save you. Let me rescue you from this situation. Let me get like really codependent with you and drag you out of this bad situation you're in as a result of your own bad choices. The third way we see people with weakened dysfunctional boundaries react to anger is they will get angry themselves. This is usually a last resort, I will say. This is usually when the person with poor boundaries, all you writers out there, you INFJs and INFPs, this is when you're pushed to the wall, you're backed into a corner, and you feel like there's absolutely, it's a last resort, right? There's no other option. You've tried to people please, approval seek, you've tried rescuing and fixing and saving, and like none of that's working. You feel totally trapped. You lash out with anger of your own. So the thing about all of these three responses, they're all unconscious responses, and they're all automatic responses. And they're all born out of the fact that when people with poor boundaries are confronted with the anger of others, they feel uncomfortable would be an understatement. They feel horrible. Their own emotions range from panicky to flustered, frozen, numb. There's like this cocktail of surging negative emotion going on within them while the person is angry in their presence. And it feels so unpleasant and so icky, they just want it to stop. So they will go into these coping mechanisms, these patterns they've used since childhood to make it stop. Like they'll do whatever they need to do to make the person not be angry anymore, even if that means violating their own boundaries, violating their own needs, not expressing their own wants, not standing up for themselves, all of that stuff, because it feels so, so hard. The person with poor boundaries cannot remain centered within themselves in the presence of an angry person. They entirely take on the angry person's emotions. They take on the processing of those emotions for the angry person. And this can also extend not just to anger, but to really any negative emotion. If someone is very sad around them, or very depressed, or just very upset or very agitated, the person with poor boundaries really tends to get in there and want to manage and carry all of those emotions for the person. Sort of like, I don't really think you can do this. I'm going to take it over for you. I'm going to manage and process those emotions for you. Again, this is just really codependence. That's what I'm describing, is the codependent process. The person who has healthy boundaries, in contrast, they are able to really remain centered around angry people or people having negative emotions. They're able to stay strong in themselves and say, I see this person's really angry right now. This is really unpleasant. But I'm still able to listen to my own needs right now, assert my own boundaries, and follow through on that, right? So they might have a coworker who's just like yelling at them, and they're having that like, oh, my adrenaline's rushing and I really don't like this, but they're able to stay centered enough to say, I see you're really angry right now, but I can't continue this conversation if you're going to be yelling at me, so I'm going to leave, right? They're able to still take care of themselves in the moment. The person with poor boundaries, they tend to disassociate in the moment. And a lot of times people with poor boundaries will say, I felt numb when it was happening. I was tongue-tied. I could barely speak. It's because they're dissociating. They're trying to escape the situation in their own mind. They're trying to frantically put distance, mental distance, emotional distance in between the angry person and themselves. Now, I know a lot of you are empaths, and that's definitely part of the equation as well. When you're an empath, it's really hard to separate yourself and to remain centered when someone's having an intense negative emotional reaction around you. That's very normal. However, if we do the boundary work, if we do it on a regular, ongoing basis, in small ways and big ways, and we're really committed to the boundary work, this stuff gets easier overall. You won't be so flooded empathically when someone's having these negative emotional reactions around you, because yourself, your true self, your heart, your soul, all that is you, your essence inside, will now understand that you have put up strong protective boundaries. So that self is protected and doesn't need to go into these unconscious patterns of people pleasing or fixing or rescuing or getting angry themselves, because that container is strong. There's a protective gate, a protective wall around your true self, and your true self knows that. So it's able to remain centered. Now, everything I just described with how people react, people with poor boundaries react to people who are having a strong anger response around them. This also happens when they get negative feedback on their writing. In fact, it happens, it unfolds in almost the exact same way. So what that looks like is the person might have given a piece of writing to someone else and they get an email with feedback about it, or they're looking at a review on Amazon that's not a very flattering review. Maybe they got a 1 or a 2-star review, but they go through the same process where they feel attacked. They take it very personally. They're unable to remain centered. They go into that fight, flight, or freeze response. They might feel frozen. They might feel numb, right? They have this sort of like emotional cocktail flooding their system. They cannot remain neutral and they cannot remain centered in the face of any negative feedback about their writing, which is part of the reason that they are in this stranglehold with crippling perfectionism, and also the stuff with procrastination, because they know if their stuff goes out into the world, if they actually finish something, put it out into the world, at some point someone's not going to like it, right? Whether that's their narcissistic mother or that's a complete stranger on Amazon, who knows? But someone out there is not going to like it, and someone out there is going to express that they don't like it. And then the writer who has very poor boundaries up until now, they suffer this total self-esteem collapse. This is because at the root of it, the writer with poor boundaries, the INFJ, the INFP, the empath, the perfectionist, the procrastinator, whatever we're calling it, that person is not emotionally independent. That is really the core of the issue. When we are not emotionally independent, the state of our emotions depends on the reactions of other people to us and the judgments of other people about us. So if someone's angry with us because we say, no, I can't go to the birthday party on Saturday, we feel like our entire self-worth is in the balance again, because they're having a negative reaction to us. That's affecting the state of our emotions on a really deep level. And I've heard from writers who say, my friend was angry with me and I didn't sleep all night, or my friend was angry with me and my stomach's been in knots for days, right? So there's usually very severe physical symptoms that come along with this. And it's because the state of our emotions, it's entirely dependent on what other people think of us and if they approve of what we're doing, or if they don't approve of what we're doing. It's a very hard way to live because you are always trying to anticipate everyone else's needs and everyone else's reactions. Again, this comes from childhood, all the dynamics that we've talked about thus far. So what happens after that? After the writer gets that negative feedback on their writing, just as with the situation where they're confronted with a very angry person, after they're out of the situation, right, after the initial sting has sort of worn off, they withdraw and they retreat. That is almost always the go-to strategy of like, oh, that burned me, I'm never doing that again. A lot of you have seen online, there's a bunch of stuff about INFJ door slamming. I have a video on my YouTube channel that talks about this as well, and I also talk about how it is a boundary issue. A lot of INFJs and INFPs, when it's happening, will tend to say like, that person's an energy vampire, that person's totally toxic, I cut them off. But they don't acknowledge that there were signs and red flags all along the way. Their boundaries were being trampled all along the way before we got to that point. And at no point did the person assert their boundaries and say, that's not okay, that's enough, until it got to this point where they just had to totally cut them off. So that will happen with the writer suffering from toxic procrastination and crippling perfectionism. When they get that bad Amazon review or they give their writing to someone else and they get that negative feedback, and because their boundary system is so weakened, they can't handle it, their emotional state just completely tanks out, and then they will completely withdraw and retreat and sometimes give up writing altogether. So this is why boundary work is so incredibly important if we really do want to move forward in our writing lives. To do any of this stuff, to create, to explore our inner self, to take creative risks, to finish a project, to have the courage and resilience to publish something, to share it with the world, We have to have strong boundaries. We absolutely have to have strong boundaries. They are the foundation. They are the framework of our personal power. They have to be in place. I know it's hard. I know it does not feel pleasant to do this work. I still struggle with myself, as I've mentioned. You have to do it. It's the first step. So what does that look like? How do we start to work on our boundaries? If you're like, okay, I'm not really looking forward to this, but I guess I'm on board, Lauren. Like, what does that look like? So I use a 3-step process with my clients that I have found works quite well. It's really simple. Step 1, we evaluate our boundaries. Step 2, we adjust and set our boundaries. And step 3, we express our boundaries. So step 1, evaluation. When we evaluate our boundaries, we look at what's going on in our lives right now. Where do we work? What kinds of relationships do we have? How do we feel about our job? How do we feel about our partner? How do we feel about our friends? Do we feel taken advantage of a lot? Do we feel walked on? Do we feel unheard or unseen? Where are the areas that we feel that we say yes too much of the time? Where are the areas we feel that we routinely say yes when we want to say no? Where do we feel burned out? Where do we feel stressed? Where do we feel fatigued, right? How many people are we giving to? We're basically looking at our relationship of giving and receiving. Usually with people with poor boundaries, giving is way, way more weighted than receiving. There's a lot more giving than receiving going on. So we're looking for those sort of like hot spots in our life. Where do I feel trampled on? Where do I feel like I'm not being heard? Number 2, we adjust and set the boundaries. So this can be done through journaling. This can be done through some quiet reflection time on your own. This one usually takes a lot more time. Usually the evaluation period, people can kind of quickly look at their life and be like, oh yeah, like it's actually my best friend. She calls me every single day and I'm really irritated. Like that one just springs to mind, or oh, it's my mother. Like she drops by unannounced all the time and she has a house key and I actually don't want her to have a house key to my house. The adjusting and setting boundaries takes a little bit more time, especially for those who are not used to doing this kind of work. When we think about adjusting and setting boundaries, we are going to think about what would make us feel better, right? So in the first step evaluation, we've really zeroed in on what makes us feel bad. It makes me feel bad when my mother drops by unannounced. It makes me feel bad when my best friend guilt trips me into the birthday party. It makes me feel bad when this happens. Like, that's what we're identifying there. Second step is, what can I do to feel better? What would feel good to me? What would feel good to me in regards to who has access to my house? Who has access to texting me? Who has access to giving me work tasks, All of those things. What would make me feel better and what would make me feel relieved, comfortable, content, calm, centered, right? So for writers who are watching this, because most of you are very sensitive people, your boundaries might be different than most. For me, one of my boundaries, I only do 3 to 4 hours of work a day. 4 is my absolute max. Now, a lot of times when I tell people that, they're like, you only work 3 to 4 hours a day? Like, that's crazy. Especially in our American culture where people are like, well, you should at least work 8 hours and probably 10, right? And I had a lot of years where I worked 8, 10, 12 hours a day. I don't do that anymore. 3 to 4 hours a day is my boundary because after 4 hours, I start feeling bad. It's really simple. After 4 hours, I start feeling tired, cranky, stressed, upset, resentful. I don't even need to list all the labels of the emotions. The point is I feel bad, right? Same thing with my email. Like if I check my email, during the evening hours when I'm off work, it makes me feel bad. I feel pressured. I feel like I have to get back to people. I feel kind of panicked, right? It makes me feel anxious and it makes me feel bad. So that's another boundary I have in place. Your own boundaries, this like, oh, what makes me feel good? What makes me feel bad? This is going to take some time for you to work out, especially for writers who struggle with toxic procrastination and crippling perfectionism, because you are probably used to overriding your system so much that when you have felt bad in the past, you just override it and you're like, that's okay, like going to the birthday party on Saturday, the thought of it makes me feel stressed out, but I feel like I have to or I'm going to feel guilty. So I'm just going to push through. I'm going to barrel through and I'm going to override my system. So that's step 2 as you're adjusting and setting your boundaries. You're learning to not override your system any longer. Step 3. This is the most difficult step for people. It's expressing your boundaries to other people. Now, guys, I've been working with boundaries for a long time. I have pretty good boundaries in my life right now. I still hate expressing my boundaries to other people. I find it so uncomfortable. I'm worried I'm going to hurt someone's feelings. I'm worried they're going to hate me. I'm worried that they need something and they're coming to me in their time of need and I'm the only person that can help them on planet Earth and I'm going to say no and everything's going to end in disaster, right? I have all that stuff too, so I know you're going to have it as well. Expressing your boundaries, the key is to take it in small steps and do it in a way that feels comfortable for you. A lot of times I feel more comfortable expressing a boundary in writing. So I have time to think about it. I have time to write out what I want to say, word it very carefully because that's something that is really means something to me is the way things are worded. I'm very careful about how I say things and the words I use. So a lot of times I will shift conversations to email because I want to have that time to write it out and be like, oh, did I want to say this or did I want to say that? Kind of rearrange things and then send it off. So if that works better for you to express things in writing or over text, do it. You don't always have to have a face-to-face conversation. Sometimes you have to have the face-to-face conversation. It's going to feel yucky. I'm just going to tell you right now. You're going to be having it and you're going to be sweating and prickly all over and feeling very uncomfortable and oh my God, I hate this. And you're going to yell at me. All that stuff's going to happen. It's okay. Just get through it. It's going to get easier every time. The more you do this work, evaluation, adjusting and setting, expressing the boundaries, the more you do this boundary work, the safer your true self is going to feel. The more it will start to emerge out of hiding because it's going to see you are protecting it. You are creating this strong, safe container for it to flourish. Your true self's oh, she's standing up for herself and, her manager had a really negative reaction to her saying she's not going to work on weekends, but she took that time for herself anyway. She's protecting us. I think I can express my true needs and my true feelings and she's still going to protect us, right? That's the message you're sending to your true self. So your true self is going to start to really come out and blossom. The more your true self blossoms, the more personal power and the more creative power you are going to have. The more you work with boundaries, more ease is going to be brought into your life overall with your writing process, with creativity overall, with your relationships, with yourself and other people. You might be someone who's I really want to work on my novel, but there's never any time. There's absolutely no time. My life is too busy. It's never going to happen. And then after you start doing this boundary work, you're actually, now there is time because I've been turning down invitations to birthday parties I don't want to go to. I've been not answering the phone when my best friend calls every single day, twice a day. This frees up more time and space. I can sit down and I can hear myself think and I can daydream. And I have this free, expansive space to sit and create, do some journaling, work on my novel, whatever I want to do. The last thing that will happen that you'll see when you do this boundary work, you will gain clarity. You will gain clarity about your own expectations and how you are attached to certain outcomes happening. Usually when people have poor boundaries because they're so dependent on the reactions of other people for their own emotional state, there's this set of illusions that they're going through where they're things have to be a certain way or I'm not going to be happy. So everyone around me has to be happy with me before I can be happy with me. Or my spouse has to be totally satisfied and happy all the time or I'm going to feel anxious, right? So there's this has to be this way or I feel bad, right? It's very simplistic. And the subconscious mind really sticks to that. This has to happen or we're going to feel bad. So then all these control mechanisms come into play. We see this in the writing process, right? I need to sit down and finish a short story this afternoon, the whole thing, and it has to be good or I'm going to feel bad. I'm going to feel like a failure. I'm going to feel like a disappointment. This is further proof that I suck as a writer. So once we start doing the boundary work, we start seeing how oh, that's actually not true, and that's not real, and that's really harmful. We're the ones putting this expectation into place that things have to be a certain way. Our writing has to be a certain way, or we're not going to be happy. When we have the boundaries into place, and we sit down, we try to write the short story, it doesn't go well, it doesn't go as planned, we get very frustrated. We're able to bounce back from that and say, that didn't unfold in the way I wanted it to, but it's okay, and I'm still going to protect my true self. Like when that inner critic comes out, the boundary's up. The inner critic can rage and rage, but there's a boundary there. Like they're only going to be allowed to rage for so long because I don't allow anyone to treat me that way. I don't allow any voice, even if it's coming from inside my own mind, to abuse me and berate me and tell me I'm a failure and I'm stupid. That's not acceptable in my world. That's not allowed in my reality. That's what happens when you start doing the boundary work. And the inner critic hears that and is like, oh, okay, guess I'm not welcome. You are the one who allows the inner critic in. You are the one who gives the inner critic any power. And if the inner critic keeps showing up and you're like, yeah, actually, I'm not listening to that. That's not allowed here. It's not acceptable. That's not the way we do things. After a while, the inner critic will get the hint and take a hike. Seriously, and I know some of you are like, I don't know, like this sounds kind of hinky, Lauren. I don't know that could ever happen. It really can. It takes a lot of boundary work, and it takes a lot of patience and a lot of love to get there, but you can get there. So, okay, speaking of expectations, next lesson, lesson 6, it's all about expectations. We're going to be talking about shifting our expectations. We're going to be talking about letting go of our expectations, how that affects the writing process, and how that creates a new kind of writing process, one that you've never used before, and then one that feels a lot better than what you were doing previously with all the procrastination and perfectionism stuff wrapped up in it. So we're going to be talking about expectations in the next lesson. Before you turn to that lesson, I do urge you to check out the journaling questions and do some work on them. As always, take it slowly, give yourself breaks. It's totally fine to sit and have cookies while you do it. Do whatever you have to do to get through it, but be good to yourself, be kind to yourself. Okay, I will see you all for the next lesson, lesson 6, expectations.